You think you know the story of the 12 disciples of Jesus, you've read the New Testament, watched the movies, maybe even grew up in church? But let me ask you something. Do you know what happened to them afterward? Because what Sunday school never told you, what your pastor never mentioned in a sermon, what most people simply don't know, is that these 12 ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors, workers, were destroyed in ways so brutal, so specific, so unbelievably insane that it's hard to believe these are real stories and not scripts from a Hollywood horror film with an unlimited budget. They walked with the Son of God. They saw the impossible. They ate with him, laughed with him, slept under the open sky with him. They were there when he multiplied the fish and the bread. They were there when he healed the blind. And after all of that, after seeing miracles with their own eyes, after hearing words that changed the course of human history, each of these men had to decide, accept what the Romans, the Jews, or the Persians had prepared for them, or run. None of them ran. That is either the most foolish thing ever done in recorded history, or the most powerful proof that they knew, absolutely knew, that what they had seen was real. Because no one dies for a lie they invented. People may die for a lie they were told and believed. That happens. But to be stripped naked, crucified upside down, stoned, cut in pieces, beheaded, skinned alive, for a story you yourself made up? That doesn't happen. It never happens. So sit down, turn off the lights. Because this goes from zero to deeply disturbing faster than anything you've ever watched. Before we dive into the individual cases, you need to understand the world these men lived in, because without this context, you'll read, "He was crucified," and treat it as something abstract, almost symbolic, like words that lost their weight from being repeated too often. Crucifixion was not symbolic. It was a technology of terror refined over centuries. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion. They inherited it from the Carthaginians, perfected the method, standardized the process, and turned it into an institution. It was, quite literally, punishment designed to be watched. It was spectacle. It was a warning. The victim would be hung along main roads where everyone passed by, so that every city, every village, every traveler would see and understand. This is what happens when you defy Rome, and it wasn't quick. Crucifixion could last 2, 3, sometimes 4 days. You didn't die from the pain of the nails. In fact, the nails were placed strategically to keep you alive longer without causing immediate death. You died from slow suffocation. To breathe while nailed to a cross, you had to push yourself up using your feet, causing unbearable pain, which made you collapse again, which crushed your lungs, which forced you to push up again. And this repeated, over and over, for days, until you no longer had the strength to push up. And then you simply stopped breathing, under the sun, in front of everyone, alive long enough to feel the birds arriving. That is the world the disciples lived in, and they chose to stand firm anyway. Now, let's talk about the men. Simon Peter. Let's start with the most famous one, the leader. The man Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church," and the same man who, just hours before Jesus' crucifixion, denied even knowing him 3 times while warming himself by a fire, Peter. Everyone knows he died. But most people don't know how. According to Origen of Alexandria, one of the most important early church fathers, Peter was crucified in Rome during Nero's persecution. But here's where it gets strange. Peter asked to be crucified upside down. Think about that. It wasn't the Romans trying to be extra cruel. It was his own request. Tradition says he felt unworthy to die in the same way as his Lord. So they inverted the cross, and upside-down crucifixion was even worse. Blood rushed to the head, pressure built inside the skull. Breathing became even harder. Modern forensic studies suggest that this method could actually prolong suffering even more. Peter likely knew it would be worse, and he asked for it anyway. Around 64 AD, during Nero's persecution after the Great Fire of Rome, Peter was executed in the Circus of Nero, the same place where today stands St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. There's a dark irony in that. The place where the man called the Rock was executed became the foundation of the largest church in the world, Andrew Peter's brother, a fisherman from Bethsaida. According to John chapter 1, he was actually the first disciple called by Jesus, before Peter, before anyone else. And yet, he's one of the least talked about. Andrew traveled farther than most, to Greece, Scythia, Asia Minor. Eventually, in Patras, Greece, around 60 A.D., he was sentenced to death, crucifixion again, but not on a traditional cross, on an X-shaped cross. And when he saw it, he didn't panic. He began to preach for 2 days. 2 days, preaching while hanging on a cross. According to early traditions, people gathered to listen. Some even began converting right there as he was dying. The governor, disturbed by the growing crowd, ordered him to be taken down. Andrew refused. James, son of Zebedee. Now the story shifts. Because James, son of Zebedee, brother of John, was the first of the apostles to die. And this isn't based on tradition. It's written directly in the Bible. In the book of Acts, chapter 12, verse 2, Herod had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. That's it, one sentence. No drama, no details, just execution. Around 44 A.D., King Herod Agrippa I ordered his death, largely for political reasons. The Jewish leaders approved, so Herod moved to gain more favor. But there's a detail most people don't know. According to early historian Eusebius of Caesarea, quoting Clement of Alexandria, the man who betrayed James, the one who turned him in, was so moved by James's courage during trial that he publicly declared himself a Christian, right there before the execution. James paused, looked at him, and said, "Peace be with you," then embraced him. And both were executed together. The betrayer died as a martyr. Philip was practical. He was the disciple who calculated the cost of feeding the crowd and said it wouldn't be enough. The realist. The logical one. And yet, he ended up far from logic. In Phrygia, modern-day Turkey, preaching. In the city of Hierapolis, he converted the wife of a Roman official. That was his death sentence. He was arrested and then executed. Some traditions say he was crucified upside down. Others say something even worse. He was crucified and then stoned while still alive on the cross. Imagine that, already nailed, already suffocating, and then rocks hitting your body until death finally comes, around 80 A.D. One of the last apostles to die. And here's the strange part. The woman he converted. She wasn't punished. She lived. Philip died for a faith that she continued. Bartholomew. Now we reach the most disturbing death of all. Bartholomew, often identified as Nathaniel, traveled as far as India and Armenia. And in Armenia, he was executed. But not quickly, not mercifully. He was flayed alive, his skin removed from his body, while he was still alive. This is not metaphor. This is not exaggeration. This is recorded in ancient Armenian tradition, one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world. And according to these accounts, he kept preaching, even during the process. Afterward, he was beheaded. Because of this, Bartholomew became the patron saint of leather workers and butchers, a dark irony rooted in his death. In art, he's often depicted holding a knife, or even holding his own skin. In the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo painted Bartholomew holding a human skin, widely believed to be a self-portrait, a Renaissance artist, leaving his identity hidden inside the image of a man who was skinned alive. That's how far this story echoes. Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector, which in that time meant one thing, traitor. He worked for Rome. He collected money from his own people. He was hated. And yet, Jesus chose him. After that, Matthew traveled, possibly to Ethiopia, Egypt, or Persia. The sources vary on location, but they agree on one thing. He was killed. Some say by the sword. Others say he was stoned and then beheaded. Around 60 A.D., there's something powerful here. A man who spent his life collecting money from others ended up giving his own life freely. Thomas, the doubter, the man who said, "I will not believe unless I see the wounds, o kappa, and touch them." And then Jesus appeared. Specifically for him, Thomas saw, Thomas touched, Thomas believed. And then he went farther than anyone else, to India. Not symbolic India, real India. In Chennai, even today, there are Christians who trace their faith back to him, known as the St. Thomas Christians. And his death? A spear. He was stabbed while praying. In India, in the 1st century. And those communities still exist. 2,000 years later. James, son of Alphaeus. Now we reach one of the most mysterious figures. James, son of Alphaeus, often called James the Less. Almost nothing is said about him individually in the Gospels. No spotlight. No dramatic scenes. No defining moment. He is almost invisible. And yet, he lived. He preached. He died. The problem is, we don't know exactly how. Some traditions say he was stoned, others say crucified, others claim something even more disturbing, that he was cut in half with a saw. And that's why in some ancient artwork he's depicted holding a saw, the symbol of his death. There's something unsettling about this. Not every story is preserved. Not every life is recorded in detail. Some people simply lived, stayed faithful, and died, without history remembering everything. Thaddeus, Jude, also called Judas, son of James, or Thaddeus. He's the disciple who once asked Jesus, "Lord, why will you reveal yourself to us and not to the world?" A deep question. Why not everyone? Why only a few? After Jesus' resurrection, Thaddeus traveled to regions like Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and parts of Iran. And there, according to ancient traditions, he was martyred, killed with an axe or a club, often alongside another disciple, Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot. Simon's title is explosive. Zealot. That likely means he once belonged to a radical Jewish movement that opposed Rome violently. A revolutionary. And here's what makes this incredible. Jesus chose him, and also chose Matthew, a tax collector who worked for Rome. Two enemies, same table, same mission, same end. Simon traveled east, likely to Persia, and there he was killed. Some traditions say he was sawn in half, others say crucified. But the message is the same. He didn't stop. Judas Iscariot. And then Judas, the one who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He didn't die as a martyr. He died under the weight of what he had done. And here's something most people don't fully process. He regretted it. The Gospel of Matthew says he returned the money, threw it into the temple, and then went out and hanged himself. But in the book of Acts, there's another description, that his body fell, burst open, and his insides spilled out. Two accounts. One likely explanation, he hanged himself, and later the body fell and decomposed. Either way, the ending is the same, despair, no redemption in his own eyes. The man who walked with Jesus couldn't believe forgiveness was still possible. John, and finally, John, the only one who didn't die violently, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the one who stood at the cross when everyone else ran. Jesus entrusted his mother to him. "Behold your mother," John lived. He wrote the Gospel of John. He wrote Revelation. He was exiled to the island of Patmos. According to early tradition, he was even thrown into boiling oil and survived. He saw all the others die, one by one. And in the end, he grew old, weak, unable to walk, carried into gatherings by others, and every time he repeated the same words, "Little children, love one another." When asked why he always said the same thing, he answered, "Because it is the Lord's command, and if this alone is kept, it is enough." Final, the part that changes everything. Now stop. Think about what you just heard. 12 men, 12 different deaths, across different continents, different empires, different methods of execution, and yet one message. Historians use something called the criterion of embarrassment. If someone claims something that goes against their own interest, something that brings suffering, danger, or death, that claim gains credibility. So the question is, what did they gain from lying? Nothing. They lost everything. They could have denied it. They could have walked away. They could have lived. But they didn't. Because their message wasn't, we believe something. It was, we saw something. That's the difference. People die for beliefs all the time. But these men didn't die for beliefs. They died for what they claimed to have witnessed. I saw him. I heard him. I touched him. That doesn't automatically prove it was true, but it proves this. They believed it was true, and they believed it so deeply that they accepted the worst deaths imaginable rather than deny it. And here's the final question. What could transform a group of terrified men hiding behind locked doors into people willing to be crucified, burned, stabbed, and torn apart, without ever taking it back? What did they see? Because whatever it was, changed the world forever. To understand why the tragic end of these 12 men was not the end of the movement, we must enter the biology of empathy. There is something called mirror neurons. It's what makes you yawn when you see someone else yawning, or feel a shiver when you see someone getting cut. In the first century, when the crowd saw Peter being crucified upside down or Bartholomew being flayed, something terrifying and fascinating happened. They didn't just see a man dying. They saw the defeat of fear. The Roman Empire ruled through the management of terror. The Roman peace, Pax Romana, was maintained by the promise of pain. But in front of the disciples, this tool broke. Imagine the Roman soldier tasked with sawing Simon in half. He is used to screams for mercy, to curses, to the smell of fear. But he finds something different. A man who forgives him. A man who looks at the executioner not as an enemy, but as a victim of the same system. This psychological short circuit was what truly brought Rome down. The courage of the disciples was contagious. The blood falling in the arena was not just biological waste. It was a genetic code of spiritual rebellion that seeped into the minds of those watching. There is a concept in existential philosophy called Geworfenheit, thrownness, or the fact that we are cast into the world without choice. The disciples were cast into a narrative they could no longer ignore. Once you see the impossible, you become a prisoner of that truth. For Thomas, it was no longer a question of believing or not believing. After touching the wounds of a risen man, skepticism died, but so did safety. The tragedy of the 12 is that they lost the right to ignorance. They knew too much. And the price of knowing too much is that you can no longer go back to your fishing net in Capernaum and pretend the world is just a place of taxes and fish. They were condemned to greatness. Every lash, every stone thrown at them was just a reminder that physical reality was a shadow compared to the light they had witnessed. The tragic end was, in fact, the only logical conclusion for lives that no longer belonged to this plane. We reach the point of greatest tension. If you want to destroy a movement, you destroy the proof. Rome had the power, the army, and the motivation. If the disciples were lying, Jesus' body would be somewhere. A corpse would have been the final argument, the nail in the coffin of Christianity. But Rome's silence on the whereabouts of the body is the loudest scream in history. The most insane part of it all? The disciples didn't die for a political ideology. They didn't want Caesar's throne. They died for a fact. If they had died fighting like the Zealots, they would be just another footnote about failed Jewish rebellions. But they died passively. They died in prayer. They transformed death, the state's ultimate weapon, into a tool of disarmament. They proved that you can kill a man, but you cannot kill a memory that refuses to be buried. Now, look at your life. We live in an era of fragile certainties and superficial comforts. We avoid pain at all costs. But here are 12 men who sought pain because they found something worth more than comfort. The tragic end of the disciples leaves us with a question that echoes through the millennia. What would you be willing to be flayed alive for? What is so real in your life that you would not deny it even under the edge of a sword in Ethiopia or in the boiling oil of Rome? The story of these ordinary men is the mirror where our mediocrity is revealed. They were not plaster saints. They were men of flesh who bled, who felt hunger, who were afraid to die. Peter likely trembled when he saw the inverted cross. Bartholomew likely screamed when the first incision was made in his skin, but they did not retreat. They proved that the greatest force in the universe is not the power that takes life, but the love that gives it up voluntarily. Their legacy is not golden cathedrals, but the fact that 2,000 years later, in a world dominated by technology and cynicism, we still stop to hear the story of 12 fishermen who decided that the truth was more important than their own skin. Rome fell. The emperors turned to dust. Nero's statues were torn down. But the words of John, the only one left to see the end of all his friends, still echo with the same brutal and simple strength. Little children, love one another. In the end, the tragedy was not theirs. It belonged to the world that tried to stop them and failed miserably. Their blood was the ink that wrote the future, and you, now, are part of this story. What will you do with this awareness? Because after knowing how they died, you can never again say you didn't know what it means, in fact, to believe in something. You have looked into the abyss. You have seen the flaying of Bartholomew, the saw of Simon, and the oil of John. But if you stay only in the horror, you have missed the code. God's message through the tragic end of the disciples is not about suffering. It is about surrender. God did not allow these men to be destroyed out of divine sadism. He allowed them to be consumed so the world would understand that matter is a fleeting lie and eternity is the only real substance. God's message to you today, through these broken bones, is this: I do not call the qualified, I qualify the available. Those men were the nothings of the world, and it is through the nothing that God builds the everything. When you feel small, when you feel your life is a script of tragedies and dead ends, remember, God uses the end to proclaim the beginning. The martyrdom of the 12 was the greatest conversation the Creator ever had with humanity. He was saying, I am worth your life. I am worth your pain. I am worth your last breath. Imagine God's gaze upon Peter's inverted cross. The world saw an old man being humiliated by the state. God saw a rock being polished for eternal glory. The divine message is that your pain has a purpose. There is no wasted suffering in the economy of the kingdom. Every drop of Thomas's blood in India was a seed of something that would last 2,000 years. God is telling you that the tragic is just a matter of perspective. What you call a disaster, He calls labor. What you call God's silence, He calls gestation. The disciples did not die alone. In the boiling oil, there was a presence. On the island of Patmos, there was a voice. The moment the sword came down on James, there was an embrace. God's message is presence. He never promised there would be no fire. He promised He would be inside the fire with you. The most insane and divine part of this story is what happened in the very next second after their deaths. The world saw a mutilated body. God saw a son coming home. God's message for your life is about the urgency of eternity. We spend our lives trying to preserve our skin, trying to avoid the scar, trying to accumulate what moths consume. The disciples understood the secret. To gain your life, you must lose it. God's voice echoes through Bartholomew's flaying to tell you, I want what is beneath your skin. I want your essence. I want your naked truth. Hide no more behind masks of success or fear. God's message is an invitation to a living sacrifice. Not a sacrifice of death, but a sacrifice of one who knows that death was defeated that Sunday morning in Jerusalem. The world system wants you to be afraid of cancellation, afraid of scarcity, afraid of loneliness, afraid of death. But the 12 disciples are proof that fear is an optical illusion. When you connect with the Creator, fear dies. God's message is an injection of fearlessness. If He is with you, who cares if the world is against you? Be like John, who survived to say that love is the ultimate law. Be like Peter, who recognized he was not worthy, but was accepted anyway. Be like Thomas, who doubted, but when he saw, gave everything. God is not looking for perfection. He is looking for faithfulness to the end. The tragic end of the 12 is God's signature on human history, saying that love is stronger than death. And that same God who held James's neck under the sword is holding you now. The tragedy ends here. Glory begins the moment you decide your life belongs to something greater than yourself. You have seen the tragic end of men whom the world would call defeated. But the Bible gives us the key to read this defeat differently. In 1 Corinthians 1:27, it is written, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong." God's message to you today is the scandal of choice. Why fishermen? Why tax collectors? Why men who, in the moment of crisis, denied and fled? Because God is not interested in your strength. He is interested in His own glory, manifested through your weakness. The tragic end of the disciples was not an accident. It was the fulfillment of a divine geometry. God allowed them to be ground down so that the fragrance of their testimony would spread to all nations. If they had lived long, comfortable lives, the message would have died with them. But in dying, they became immortal in the memory of the kingdom. To understand why there was such violence, we must hear the words of Jesus Himself in John 12:24. "Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." This is the law of spiritual harvest. God's message is that nothing in your life is wasted when it is placed in the Creator's hands. You may be going through a grinding process right now. You may feel crushed by circumstances, fear, or loss. But God's message is, you are not being buried, you are being planted. The disciples were the kernels of wheat that fell to the ground in Rome, India, Armenia, and Ethiopia. They died so that today billions of people could eat from the bread of life. God is telling you that your current suffering has the potential to produce fruit you cannot even imagine. The tragedy is not dying. The tragedy is remaining alone, guarding your life for yourself, protecting your skin, and losing your purpose. At the height of the persecution, when John was exiled to Patmos and watched his brothers being martyred one by one, the voice of God brought the final promise in Revelation 2:1-10. "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown." This is not a message of cheap comfort. It is a message of iron conquest. God is not promising to take you out of the trouble. He is promising the crown if you remain faithful through the trouble. God's message to you is a call to radical resilience. The world can take your freedom, your goods, even your skin as it did to Bartholomew, but it cannot take your crown. The disciples knew this. They did not look at the sword or the cross. They looked at the one who holds the keys of death and Hades. The climax of this message is the absolute certainty of victory. The world sees the tragic end, but God proclaims in Romans 8:37, "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us." Note the phrase, more than conquerors. A conqueror is one who survives. A more than conqueror is one who even in death conquers the enemy's territory through their sacrifice. The disciples did not lose to Nero. They conquered Rome with their blood. They did not lose to the spear in India. They conquered the heart of a nation. God is telling you, nothing can separate you from my love. Neither death nor life, nor angels nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come. If you are in Christ, your end is just a change of scenery. Tragedy is an optical illusion for those who do not know eternity. God's message to you ends with an invitation. The 12 accepted the invitation of a carpenter by a lake and ended as pillars of human history. God is calling you today to step out of your comfort zone, your fear, and your mediocrity. Life is too short to be lived only for oneself. The tragic end of the 12 disciples is proof that living for something greater than yourself is the only way to truly live. God is breathing upon you now a spirit of courage, love, and a sound mind. Do not fear what man can do to you. Fear only living a life without purpose. Look at the 12. Look at the blood. And see, behind it all, the smile of a God who says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord."